H-A-B-E-R.
W-I-O-T-H-A-B-E-R.
That's right.
Oh.
Good afternoon. My name is William Daly, D as in David, A-I-L-E-Y, and I'm one of the attorneys for the Ethical Society of Police. On June 22nd, Ethical convened a press conference to announce its efforts to acquire a memorandum of understanding with the county executive, Dr. Sam Page, in St. Louis County. It ended up being a historic day because we were able to announce that morning that Dr. Page did in fact sign an MOU. So the press conference really just talked about the journey and the process of getting the MOU signed, and then we were optimistic about the possibilities of getting MOUs signed by Chief Mary Barton of the St. Louis County Police Department and the Board of Police Commissioners. At the end of the June 22nd press conference, there was a period for questions and answers. And during that period, there was one series of questions that were focusing specifically on the new diversity and inclusion unit in St. Louis County. I'm paraphrasing, but the first question was whether or not there had been any interactions with Lieutenant Keith Wildhaber, who's over that department. The answer was, we have not had very many. There was a follow-up question as to why. The response was, you have to ask Lieutenant Wildhaber that question. And then the third question was, have you reached out to him? And the answer was yes. 3 questions, 3 answers. The segment lasted less than 27 seconds. Also during the press conference, there was a question with respect to the MOU. A copy of the MOU had been submitted, and there was a question as to whether there's any real power behind the MOU, the Memorandum of Understanding. And at that time, I said, it's too early to tell. It was important to look at the clock from that day forward and to see what happened, and to whether the MOU had any substance, or was it just a piece of paper. And then there was a final question, at least for the purposes of this press conference today, where it was a mention of a request for a meeting from Chief Mary Barton, and whether the request for a meeting was simply kicking the can down the road. And we responded at that time, it's too soon to tell, and it would be unfair to see whether or not Chief Barton, or to say whether or not Chief Barton was going to do anything different than what was expressed in the MOU, and to give her an opportunity to somewhat exercise the provisions that's inside of it. Although that was a historic day for Ethical, and a great day for Ethical, and Ethical was very optimistic about what was going to happen, no less than 24 hours later, we saw just how fortuitous things were. Because on that day, Lieutenant Keith Wildhaber, the head of the Diversity and Inclusion Unit at St. Louis County, went to Facebook. And in his Facebook post, I've blown up a portion of it here, but the key is he went on to talk about the June 22nd press conference, the 3 questions and the 3 answers that were given with respect to the Diversity and Inclusion Unit, and essentially said that this was a parade of lies. And after this parade of lies, Unethical Society of Police is a more fitting name. This was published to his Facebook page, and shortly thereafter was published again on the KSDK website. The reason why this is problematic is it goes beyond just the accusation that there was a parade of lies, or that this is the Unethical Society of Police. This is problematic because this is the head of diversity and inclusion for St. Louis County. This is essentially the face of diversity and inclusion in St. Louis County. And so what should have been a day of celebration, what should have been a good time as we look forward in the St. Louis community, it turned into a petty attack on Facebook. But it didn't stop there. Because on July 9th, 2020, at the Board of Police Commissioner meetings, there was a section of that meeting that was allocated for the Diversity and Inclusion Unit to speak about what it had done. What had the Diversity and Inclusion Unit been up to for the first part of this year? And instead of just focusing on the benefits and the strides and the good accomplishments, Lieutenant Wildhaber again went on the attack. And he repeated the same allegations with respect to the press conference and the statements that were made. 3 questions, 3 answers. The key of which was, we have not had very many meetings. And so he felt it important to speak to his position and why he got the position. He made comments, and Sergeant Taylor's going to address this later, but he made comments with respect to this belief that certain people don't want him in his position because of his race. Beyond that, there was an immediate interview with KSDK after the Board of Police Commissioners meeting, where Lieutenant Wildhaber once again went on and repeated the same allegations. And in the KSDK article that followed up the Board of Commissioners meeting, the officer was stated by name as lying and misrepresenting his record. And it went on to repeat those allegations in stunning detail. So we now have a third instance where the chair of diversity and inclusion for St. Louis County, the face of diversity and inclusion in St. Louis County, is again attacking a subordinate and attacking this organization. It's troubling and it's problematic just on the surface, but really what we're here for today is to look at how do we get back to progress? How do we get back to the place where we can move beyond these allegations and move beyond these lies? After the Board of Police Commissioners meeting, the chief came in and apologized for what she said was inappropriate remarks. The HR executive for the St. Louis County Police Department came in and apologized for what was looked at as inappropriate remarks. It's my understanding that the chair of the Board of Police Commissioners delivered an apology from the chief based on the display that took place at that Board of Police Commissioners meeting. And yet those apologies only begin to tell the story as to what we're facing right now in St. Louis County and what we're facing in the police department. So it's important today that we speak out and we set the record straight. Prior to today, all of the news media outlets had a video feed and an audio feed of what was stated at that meeting, at the press conference. You can hear with your own ears the answer to the question, which was, we have not had very many meetings. Yet instead of focusing on the fact that there had not been very many meetings, it's now turned into an attack, where diversity and inclusion has declared war against the ethical society. So today what we want to do is we want to look at these memorandums of understanding and see if they have meaning. Because after Dr. Page signed the memo of understanding, the chief of police, as well as the Board of Police Commissioners on June 30th, also entered into a memorandum of understanding. And so this document does have meaning. That is not just kicking the can down the road, and that is not just empty or devoid of power. It's important to look at what it says, because it says that this document is a recognition of the importance of ESOP's stated goals and a recognition of the shared respect for ESOP's advocacy on behalf of the minority community. So the chief is recognizing the importance of ESOP's message. The chief is recognizing and looking at the Ethical Society as a valued partner with what she intends to do for the department. And to her credit, she did not invent this mess. She was not the person who placed Lieutenant Wildhaber in his current position. But it's on her shoulders that this mess now rests. And she has the ability, she has the responsibility, and she has the power to do something about it. We're not talking about another meeting. We're not talking about another survey. We're not talking about an outside consultant to look at and see what's going on. We want to see actionable change with respect to the diversity and inclusion unit in the St. Louis County Police Department, because this cannot be allowed to continue. So at this point, Sergeant Taylor is going to speak specifically as to some of the allegations that were levied at ethical with respect to Lieutenant Wildhaber's appointment.
About this social distancing. So, I'm Heather Taylor. I'm the president of the Ethical Society of Police. On June 22nd, like Attorney Daly stated, we had a press conference. During that press conference, we addressed the MOU, and Officer Hall made a statement in response to a statement about meeting with Lieutenant Wildhaber, and she stated, we have not had very many meetings. Essentially, we didn't have very many meetings with him, which is true. From that statement, it's blown up into what we have now. And here's the thing is that if we cannot, as minority officers, stand up for ourselves and stand up for our community, what good are we? We have to stand up. We have to fight. And it's important that we fight this, because what Lieutenant Wildhaber did was unethical. It was wrong. The article was unethical. The original article was unethical and wrong. when Lieutenant Wildhaber states that we are against him in the diversity and inclusion unit because he's a white male, that's an absolute lie. Me as an African-American female, I know discrimination. I've been discriminated against because of my race and my gender. If someone came to me and stated, Heather, we want to appoint you to diversity and inclusion, I'm going to decline. Because number one, I don't have the experience. Number two, I don't have the educational background to do that job. And also by Lieutenant Wildhaber's own statements, he stated that he didn't have the training for the position. His own words state that. So when we state that we do not believe that he was qualified for the job, that's why. That's it. It's not about his race. It's about qualifications, because you have diversity and inclusion units all around the country that have people who have degrees specifically in that, who have decades of experience. And you cannot really be an ally to everyone if you believe that your own cause is the only cause. There's more to that. That's why I would never accept a position of diversity and inclusion just because I've been discriminated against as a black female officer. It's more to it than that. We would also like to talk about, go into a little bit more detail about retaliation with Officer Hall. During that June 22nd press conference, we talked about specifically that we were fearful that she would face retaliation. And here we are on July the 9th, and it happened. It happened just as we said it was going to happen. And you have someone who is a commander that makes these statements about a subordinate. And we had no one internally within that police department until after, except for Dr. L.J. Punch, who said something, who challenged him on that statement. And all around the country, what do we see? We see officers failing to act, failing to stand up for what's right. In that moment, everyone should have stood up for what was right, because that was a personal attack. And if we can't stand up for our community, and we can't stand up for our officers, what good are we? And that's the only statement I have on this.
So I got a question. So who is responsible for his appointment as head of diversity and inclusion? And he says he's untrained for the position. How does one get appointed to that particular position? Like, you know, if that's the case. I mean, he applied for the job, but what process do they go through to become to be in that position?
And I will have Attorney Will Daly answer that.
Okay.
Well, this much we know. The appointment was made by the prior chief of police, John Beller. After the lawsuit where Lieutenant Wildhaber received a $20 million verdict and ultimately settled with the county for $10 million, he was promoted to lieutenant and placed over the newly created diversity and inclusion unit. This was something that John Belmer did. As the chief of police, he had the power and authority to make the appointment. I am not aware as to whether or not there was an application process. I am not aware as to whether or not there were requests made. For example, we're familiar with the sergeant promotional process. It's a policy that's in place. It's announced to the officers who want to apply to be a sergeant. They'll take a test to measure certain criteria, and then the top scores on that test are then given the opportunity to interview for a sergeant's position. I do not know whether that particular or a process of that type was put in place with respect to the diversity and inclusion chair. But what we do know is that it's possible to see whether there's objective criteria that you would look for someone who can be over diversity and inclusion. There may be certain skills and training and degrees and programs. There are officers, in fact, ethical members who are certified as diversity and inclusion trainers. They train the trainers to teach other people diversity and inclusion. So we know that there's a curriculum. We know that there's a body of information and knowledge that deals specifically with diversity and inclusion, and there are professionals for other industries and other organizations who specialize in diversity and inclusion. I do not know whether Lieutenant Wildhaber has any such training. I believe that at the Board of Police Commissioners meeting, he stated that he did not, but that he was uniquely qualified because of his lived experiences and this is no knock on anecdotal qualifications or lived experiences, but there's something to be said about lived experiences. Because if I needed a heart surgery, quadruple bypass, you have to cut open my chest, and there was a foot doctor who had suffered a heart attack, I wouldn't want that foot doctor to operate on me and do this complex surgery just because he or she had suffered a heart attack. And so essentially I think what Lieutenant Wildhaber has suggested is that his qualifications are based on his life. We didn't make this racial. It's very important to understand the Ethical Society did not make this conversation racial. There were comments that were stated in the KSD interview. There were comments that were stated at the Board of Police Commissioners meeting by Lieutenant Wildhaber, where he said people were against him in this position because he was a white male. Ethical never said anything about him being a white male. He injected the fact that he's a white male into the conversation. And so his lived experiences as a white male become relevant into his qualifications based on his criteria as being the, I guess, qualified, yet alone the best qualified for that position.
What can I ask? What do you want to see going forward from here? The next steps.
We want a champion for diversity. We want a champion for diversity who's in that position. Not someone who would, based on a misunderstanding, based on a bias, based on a filter, based on anything, to jump to the conclusion and not, it's not even a matter of due process, not have the decency and the courtesy to look at Ethical as a valued partner in this police department and address that situation the same way you would with anyone else. You don't run to the media, you don't run to the press and state this prior to there at least being a meeting of the minds. And I think what makes today a little bit different, is that there was an effort or an attempt to see what was going to happen after the Facebook post, but it didn't stop. And then there was a thought, well, maybe by the time, we let it die down and the Board of Police Commissioners meeting happens, then maybe it'll die down. But then it went straight to the press. And then you have 3 different opportunities and it became necessary to say something. It became very important to say something at that point.
So you've gotten these apologies from high-ranking officials within St. Louis County there, but he himself has not made any kind of retraction or anything like that to date, you're saying, for the statement that he made while here?
I do not know. I know that, to my knowledge, no such retraction has been published. I do not know whether Lieutenant Wildhaber has spoken with or to anyone about his comments at the Board of Police Commissioners meeting. I do not know whether Lieutenant Wildhaber has, as I stand here right now, made contact with Officer Hall. I can say comfortably, up to probably at least 20 or 30 minutes ago, I don't believe any such conversation had taken place.
What about with KSDK? Have they said anything?
I'll let Sergeant Taylor address that.
Okay.
So, I won't get into the specifics of the emails, but I can say that we have met with them, and we've talked to them, that is, and from talking to them, the article that originally came out was changed to include our perspective in there. I spoke to the reporter as well, and ultimately spoke to KSDK, did change the article, which is night and day from what was originally published. It was more balanced afterward, definitely, compared to what it was. But I think it's another point that needs to be made about the disconnect between Lieutenant Wildhaber and Ethical. We're more than willing to sit down with him and continue the meetings that we've already had with him. But it's important for him to understand that you cannot put information out there that's not true. You have to vet that. It's important to do that. And I know that he has some issues with Ethical and me in particular. But when it's time to meet, everyone that I've met with in this police department or in the street hasn't always been someone that I agreed with or was my friend. I had a job to do, I had to be professional. and I had to do that job that way. I have repeatedly said that I believed he was discriminated in some rights with what happened to him. And so the jury ultimately made that decision. We have never said that he was not qualified because of his race. Race has nothing to do with it. Qualifications have something to do with it. That's it. I cannot go in as an African-American female who has been repeatedly discriminated against on this department, on St. Louis City Department, and believe that I can come in then as the diversity and inclusion commander or supervisor because of my lived experience. No, you need to have actual experience and training. That's important. So that's why, again, why we believe that he wasn't qualified for that position. Nothing else to do with his race, is because of qualifications.
Was the apologies directed like from the chief and things? Were those directed towards Ms. Hall, or were they directed towards the organization?
To Officer Hall.
While I wanted to clarify one thing. We'll take a picture of that Facebook post at the end, but I did want to clarify just to make sure it was completely clear that Wildhaber was sharing KSDK's video, not the other way around. So at the beginning, I just want to make sure that was really clear. They weren't reposting his Facebook post. He was sharing theirs, just to make sure we're 100%.
Okay. Can we do a recap? The original press conference, what was it about?
It was about the memorandum of understanding that was finally signed by Dr. Page and St. Louis County Police Department.
All right, can you define the memorandum of understanding?
It's basically that they will sit down and meet with us and talk to us about things that are specific to us as African American officers and from our community as minorities in particular.
Up until that point, did you guys have any meetings on that?
Yes, we had meetings, they just weren't fruitful, and at one point, all meetings ceased to happen.
Why was it necessary to have those meetings in the first place?
Because we have about 10% African American officers in St. Louis County. There is a definite need for more diversity there, and that's what Ethical Society is about.
Okay, how long has Ethical Society been around?
Since 1972.
What's the purpose?
The purpose is to bring together our community and our officers and to address systemic racism within police departments and in our community.
You mentioned Officer Hall, who is she?
Officer Hall is a board member with the St. Louis County Police Department, African American female.
Okay, how is she related in this press conference right now?
She is the person that was the target of the statement that was put out by KSDK, a news article. There was also a statement that was made at a board meeting on July the 9th.
Okay, as far as the article, I don't know if you want to get any type of details with it. I heard you say that it has been revised. Why did the article that that news organization put out had to be revised?
Because it had things that were a lie. It had things in there that was a lie. I think the video that we used to refute it is real STL News video that actually had her statement in there. You could hear Officer Hall stating that they met with them. And what was posted instead by the reporter and the news organization was something separate.
Okay, as far as the gentleman that put the Facebook post up, a lot of people in our live stream right now is asking what exactly did he do, what exactly did he say that was wrong. Could you go ahead and give us some type of insight?
So Lieutenant Wildhaber is the diversity and inclusion commander for the entire St. Louis County Police Department. And he was at a board meeting with the community and St. Louis County police commissioners, community, a number of commanders, reporters, and he stated, he put information out there that Ethical said that they had met with him. That was a lie. That was a lie, and that information was totally untrue. And he stated that, on his Facebook post that we're unethical. He's made a number of disparaging statements over a period of time about the Ethical Society of Police. And it's very difficult. We are mostly minority. We're probably 99% African American in St. Louis County. We're 97, 98% in St. Louis City. And it's important for someone who's in a diversity and inclusion. I mean, you have to include everyone. You have to be fair. You have to be impartial. You have to not have those biases. He's over that division. And if he's saying those things about Ethical, who's mostly minority, mostly African American, how are we going to ever feel like we're included with him? If we cannot go to him and talk about issues that our community face with inclusion, and he thinks this way about us as minorities, how are we ever going to resolve complaints and issues that come from our community? Most of the things that you see that are exposed with officers in this area, it's ethical coming forward and saying it was wrong, whether it was black, white, or whomever. We could care less. We're not going to go out and say something's right and it's wrong. We have to be that voice, and a lot of things that we receive are complaints from our community about discrimination along racial lines. We get inboxes, we get emails, we get phone calls about it, and when they come to us, guess what we have to do? We have to report them. But if who the person is that we're reporting it to believes that we're unethical, how can we ever resolve that for our community that only feels comfortable talking to us? It's a difficult space to be in. How can we champion what's right for people who are actually out there that have faced discrimination at the hands of officers, all officers, and they come to us as a trusted source? That's a very difficult space to be in, and it's very important that we're able to follow through, report this to people, and have them do something about it, and have them hold people accountable for things that are along those lines.
Can you explain, like, this, so you guys are having trouble having this MOU signed. Can you explain the dynamic, like, did the fraternal order police or the POA, like, well, I mean, you guys are the only entity that we're looking, that have something like this in place, correct?
No. What happens is that it's a long kind of explaining the State Board of Mediations. So the State Board of Mediations certifies elections of everyone but police officers and teachers. That's just how it is. So we're all considered police associations, but we can be voluntarily recognized by a city entity, meaning St. Louis County, St. Louis City. They can enter into an agreement with them. And so that's what they have in the collective bargaining agreement in St. Louis County with the Fraternal Order of Police, and what they have in St. Louis City. So there's only one that's recognized. It can only be one. So we have the FOP is a recognized bargaining entity in St. Louis County. So when the St. Louis County chief mistakenly said that she could not meet with us because we weren't, they were on the exclusive bargaining entity, and she excluded us after making the statement that there was no systemic racism. Well, she's wrong. They can meet with anyone at any time, but they weren't meeting with us in good faith and talking to us. And all we asked was, here's the memorandum of understanding. You meet with us so that we can discuss the issues that are going on in our community, issues that are going on with our officers. That's all we were asking for. That's it. And that was a fight. It was a fight for 2 years almost, since 2018. So that's what we're doing.
So I think, is there any remaining words that you'd like to say before we finish up?
I have nothing more to add.
Thank you.
Thank you for joining us